Welcome everybody. This is Tim Ash, the CEO of SiteTuners, and we're glad that some of you are joining us for the first time or again for one of our monthly informational webinars. This month we have a great webinar for you. Our featured speaker is Maurits Kaptein. He is one of the founders of Science Rockstars and Persuasion API, and way too overeducated for my taste. No, just joking. He has a PhD with honors from Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands, and has done postdoctoral research in Finland, as well as other work all over the world practically. And he focuses on three key areas: persuasive technologies, different research methods, and dynamic adaptation. And the reason we brought him out of the ivory tower is because he doesn't live there all the time. He actually is one of those guys who's super smart and wants to actually change the world and make a difference. So his research often applies to online marketing and how to, in real time, persuade people to take action. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please tweet the crap out of this. You see our Twitter handles there on the screen, as well as the hashtag for the webinar, which is Persuasion API. And go ahead and make some noise. Also, for those of you that will inevitably ask again, yes, we are recording this, and anybody who's registered will get a copy of the video link sent to them, as well as the slides after this. So we'll follow up. At the end of this, we'll have a Q&A. So you'll have in your control panel a question pane. Go ahead and use that to ask questions throughout the webinar during the last 15 minutes. We will get to as many of those as we can. All right, well, without further ado, I'm going to throw it over to Maurits and let him introduce himself and take it away.
Hi there. So, hope everyone is here and everybody can hear me, actually. So it's always weird to do these things without any feedback of an audience.
We can hear you great.
We can hear you great. Cool. Nice to know. Cool. Well, thank you all for showing up. I'm right here in the Netherlands currently, where it's starting to get evening, and yeah, I'm going to be talking a bit about persuasion profiling, is what we call it. And basically, what I'm going to try to do is run you through where this came from. So basically, some of my research, but obviously also some of the research of others, because you always build on other people's work to actually advance. So I'm going to introduce some ideas about persuasion. What is it? Where did it come from? And then how did we get to profiling? And in the end, I'll talk a bit about what we actually do with the company and how we make persuasion profiling possible for lots of our clients on a fairly large scale. That's kind of the setup for today. Just to start, where would you know us from, or have we been featured anywhere? Some of the persuasion profiling stuff is covered in Forbes. We've been on TechCrunch, and actually over 1.5 years ago started out in Wired, who started paying attention to a lot of the persuasion profiling work, but basically started it on the research end. This was when we were kind of starting to set up the company. The company is around for about 2 years by now. But I'll introduce you first about the research part and what is it, what are we talking about with persuasion profiling. So what I want to do today is basically talk you through what is persuasion profiling, what do we do, and I'll do it by basically answering 5 fairly simple, I would say, questions. And the first, I'm going to keep fairly short. First question is what is persuasion? You're talking about persuasion profiling, but what is persuasion to begin with? And to me, and this is what I've been studying for years, basically the goal of persuasion is just to change somebody's attitudes or behavior. I'm not necessarily interested in selling or one type of behavior or another type. I'm interested in the ways in which you can get whatever you ask from other people, in which you can get it to be more effective. So if you ask somebody to do something, if you ask somebody a favor, or if you ask somebody to buy something, or if you're trying to sell something, how do you make it more effective? I think that's what we talk about when we talk about persuasion, and this has been heavily studied. I mean, 2,000 years ago, people were thinking about how do we persuade and convince people. That knowledge is obviously extended, built upon, iterated, but that's what I like to think about and play with. Now, the obvious first question is, well, does that even work? And this is an old experiment which many of you might know. I'm not going to dwell on it too long, But the basic idea was trying to get people to reuse their towels in hotel rooms to save the environment. And the researchers, Professor Chialdini, tried a few different versions of signs in hotel rooms. And these signs either said, please reuse your towel, please reuse your towel because most people reuse their towel during the stay, or the third version was, please reuse your towel. Most people who stayed in this room actually reuse their towel. Now what you find is that there's a 24% more towel reusage in the second case, the moment you appeal to the fact that other people are doing something. And what I find interesting about this is you're asking the exact same thing, and the goal of the behavior is the same. It's the way in which you phrase it by appealing to what other people have done that makes it more effective. So the third case, please, or most people who stayed in this room reuse their towel, was slightly more effective even than the middle one. And this is explained by the idea that, well, people do what other people do and are even more likely to do it if those other people are similar to them. So if you have people who stayed in this room, apparently they're similar to you because you're staying in the room at that moment in time too. So that makes more people reuse their towel. I find these interesting things. This is like, how do you actually sell something? It's not what do you sell or what do you get people to do, but how do you do it to make it more effective? So basically, the bottom line for me, what is persuasion, is just, it's about how you ask. Now, can we think a bit more structurally about how you ask? This is what scientists have been doing for years, and the same professor who did the previous study actually summarized a bunch of this work into saying, well, there are 6 principles of persuasion. And I want to add at forehand that I don't necessarily think that these are the only 6 means by which you can make appeals more effective. However, they are a super useful summary of a lot of the work that has been done in social psychology, in marketing, and they're a very useful tool, basically, these 6 principles, to think about how do I make my own communication more effective, how do I make websites more effective, how do I make emails more effective, by basically just looking at these different principles of persuasion. Now, there's 6 here on this slide, and I'm going to give you a few rudimentary examples of each, and maybe some of the research work that actually led to it. Social proof, obviously, we just discussed an example. The towel example is basically saying that other people have done something apparently makes it more likely for people to do this. We find this online, where we show bestsellers, where we show ratings by other people, where we show popular products. All of these are appeals to the idea that other people have done something and that should make it more likely for you to also do it. Then a second principle is the idea of liking. What does liking mean? Basically, the simple idea that if a friend of yours comes up to you and asks for $10, you're more likely to give it than when it's somebody you don't know, you don't like, whatever. If you like somebody, you're more likely to do something for them, whatever it is that they ask. Now, how do you get to liking, or how do you use this online? One of the things that drives liking, especially in early contact, is the idea of similarity between people. So if I know that you go surfing, I go surfing, then we share some background, we like each other more, and are more inclined to listen to each other. This is exactly what offline salesmen do when they try to basically establish some kind of similarity between him or her and the client. It's building this idea of liking. Third one, authority. People are more inclined to do things when they're recommended by experts or authorities. This is why we have toothbrush commercials with people with white lab coats. Now, I'm not necessarily sure whether those work perfectly. However, there's lots and lots of scientific evidence that says if you ask somebody to do something, or you have that same question phrased by an authority figure or by an expert, by and large, over a group of people, people are going to be more inclined to actually do it, to actually comply. Fourth one, commitment. People are inclined to do whatever they say or write down that they will do in the future. I think Amazon has a fantastic example using their wish list, where they basically say, look, you want to buy this product in the future, you're going to tell us you want to buy it in the future, and because you want to be consistent, because you want to do what you've committed to, you're actually more likely to buy it in the future. The fifth one, scarcity, is the idea that people are appealed to things that seem scarce in one way or another. So things that are almost out of stock, discounts that are only there for a week. Very simple study was just comparing pitching of books, and basically what the researchers did was say, look, here's a book, how much are you willing to pay, to one group of people. The other group of people saw the same book, exact same question, They were just told that there was only 3 more in stock. And what you'll find is, on average, people are willing to pay more for the book that is scarce. So scarcity, another way of making appeals more effective. And the last one that Cialdini kind of recognizes or summarizes is this idea of reciprocity, where reciprocity means that if I do something for you, you're more inclined to do something for me. So if I can give you a gift in one way or another and actually ask you to comply to a request afterwards, you're going to be more inclined to do it than when I do not give you something in advance. One of the things to keep into account, though, if you're actually trying to do reciprocity online, it's just our own experience, is that actually like giving or doing the promise that you'll give something to people after they buy something, it's much less effective than actually giving out something to people beforehand. So reciprocity works if I do something for you afterwards, you'll do something for me. So those are the 6 principles of persuasion, and that's basically where I started a lot of my thinking. These things are around, they have been around for quite a while, but what I started thinking about is basically how do we actually effectively use all of this. So if we want to use these persuasion principles to become more effective in, for example, online selling or to make more effective email campaigns, how do we actually do it? And one of the questions is basically, should we use all of the persuasion that we can think of? So you can imagine that we could pitch a product using multiple of these strategies. We can say that it's popular, we can say that it's almost out of stock, we can say that it's recommended by some authority, and just pitch all of these things jointly for one product. What we see is currently persuasion is being used a lot online. We see popular destinations, we see things like almost only 2 t-shirts left, for example, on the Threadless website on the right. We see that these things are being used. We actually often see them being used jointly. So lots of them, people are trying to pile them up. Basically, you can say if somebody has read Cialdini's work and has thought about how to do this online, you see people just piling up their website with lots of this stuff. Now what we did a series of studies to actually find out whether this is actually effective. One of the studies, for example, was just using a lot of Google ads, trying to see if it could improve click-through, and using either one or multiple implementations of these persuasion principles. And what we find is that consistently, if you start averaging over lots of these ads, basically the ads that use multiple of these principles were less effective than the ads that use a single one. We replicated this not only for ads but also for websites in a lot of different settings, and we keep finding the same thing. Basically, you need to make a selection of what you're pitching to people. Apparently people don't believe it anymore. I don't know, they're put off in some way when there's lots of these arguments present. So while they're effective, it's not necessarily true that they all just pile up in their effect. And from that idea, we basically got to the conclusion, okay, so there's one of these strategies, or at least you might not want to pile all of them up. Then how do you become effective? Basically, which of these do you actually use, and do you use the same one for everyone? So that got us to the 4th question, are we all the same? Which is kind of a stupid question because we all know that we're not all exactly the same. I mean, there's differences between all of us. What I find more important, though, is whether those differences are actually of importance, for example, for marketers. So if you start thinking about what's the effect of an authority appeal, what's the effect of a consensus appeal, what you want to think about is not whether people are different, because they likely are different, but whether that difference is so big to actually be important for you to care about. And basically that led us to the idea that if you start thinking about differences between individuals, and this is true in all kinds of domains, there's 2 kind of qualitatively different scenarios that happen. And one is this simple idea that's in the little plot that might be a bit confusing on the left. Basically what the plot says is that this dashed vertical line is, for example, how likely are you to buy a book when there's none of these principles present. And what you find is that on average, which is the vertical blue line, if you, for example, use a scarcity argument, people are more inclined to buy. So the average actually goes to the right. Now what I've tried to plot is how do individuals behave. Not all individuals are the exact same, but in this situation, for all of the individuals, the effect is indeed positive. So using this scarcity Q is going to be positive for everyone. Might be a bit more positive for one customer than for the other, but it's going to be positive for everyone. On the other hand, you can find a similar shift in the average effect. So actually the mean, if you start, for example, A/B testing, the use of these different strategies or these different principles, that mean will be the exact same, but now individuals are really, really spread out up to a level that actually for some of the individuals, it becomes less likely that they buy the book if it's scarce, or it becomes less likely for them to buy the t-shirt, whatever they want to buy, when lots of other people have it. So when you use social proof, basically some of these strategies might backfire. These are the two things that we kind of wanted to distinguish between while setting up some of this research. And what we then tried to do is follow people around for quite some time. And what we did was follow people around, follow how they moved around the web store, where they could buy books, DVDs, movies, everything. And we just followed individual people and saw how they responded to usage of these different principles. We were actually able to manipulate which principle was pitched to which person at which time. And this allowed us to create a data set where we could actually in the end say, okay, we have multiple observations for each of the consumers on how they respond to these different strategies. That allowed us to not only estimate the effect on average, which is basically what a lot of the Cialdini work and the earlier work on social influence or these persuasion principles is built on. It allowed us to actually estimate the effect for individuals. But the basic idea is, can we make a distinction between these qualitatively different scenarios that are on the slide now? And what we found is that people are hugely different. Hugely different, why do I say hugely? Well, for example, the authority strategy, we found that about 1/3 of the people was less likely to actually buy a book that was pitched by an authority than they were to buy a similar book when it was not at all pitched by an authority, so when the principle was not present. And that difference is so big, despite the fact that on average, if you just looked at the whole group, the books that were supported by authority principles were sold more than those that weren't. So what we found was the same average effect, but a really, really large spread between people. However, people seem to be fairly consistent. What do I mean by fairly consistent? Well, very simple. We followed people around for a few weeks and then tried to predict a week later which of these strategies would actually work well. We'd actually do fairly well predictions. Basically, we're able to say, look, this guy seems to respond to authority, seems not to respond to social proof. We can learn this, and from this derive how should we approach people in the future. And now I want to get back to this point, which I think is the core interesting thing about using persuasion, because if I use, for example, ideas of behavioral targeting, recommender systems, where I try to pick which person does, or which product does somebody want that did not get time, well, if people actually buy the product, then the value of that information is going to be limited. What we find here, though, is that it's not about which product you buy, which I think is something you should optimize, and you should keep using all of these things. However, if you know how to pitch a product to people, even if they buy the product, if they come back for another book, or if they come back, you send them another email, you can still use these same persuasion principles, because apparently that's what makes these people tick. And then we got to the idea of persuasion profiles. Which basically is, how do we actually use the fact that people are so substantially different in how they respond to these strategies? How can we use it, for example, in online marketing, although we found many different applications for the same idea? Well, when we started working with persuasion profiles, one of the core things that we started doing was trying to not represent people as different buckets in one way or another. Basically, we try to not start from the idea that there's authority people, social proof people, reciprocity people. We started from the idea of a persuasion profile that said, look, we're just going to keep for every individual user a profile which just contains the estimates of how well or how likely it is that people will respond to a certain strategy. And what we keep is the estimate of the effect and our uncertainty about that effect, around that effect. So if there's a new guy, we hardly know anything about him, we're going to be very uncertain in our estimates. But if we follow somebody, we see another reply to an email, or we see a few clicks within a session on different web pages, we can refine our profile and get better and better. And basically what we do, I think, with persuasion profiling is we're one of the few people that are actually focusing not necessarily on how to personalize and optimize over what you offer to people, but basically what we're trying to do is optimize how you pitch your people or how you pitch products to people. Now, how do we actually do this in practice? I've told you a bunch about the research work, where this came from, and why we're trying to do this. But how is it done in practice? Basically what we do, mostly our process when we actually start doing this with clients, is that the first thing we do is review sales strategies. How do you sell your product? And we try to create content, and basically what we end up with, if you have a certain product that you're pitching, we create multiple versions of that same product that all have different implementations of these persuasion principles. That's what we start with, and from there, usually customers integrate with our services to actually start doing the logging, but that's not what I want to talk about a lot. What I basically want to talk about is what you need to get this persuasion profiling going. It's just knowing which content you're showing to whom. So you need some ID of a person, some way of tracking a person, at least knowing his or her previous behavior. You need to know which content you're showing, so which of these principles are you pitching. And you need to know the success. Do people click? Do people buy? How long they look? And that's basically the first thing we set up. From there, what we do is log the successes of each of these attempts. And each of these attempts actually accumulate fairly quickly. If somebody browses your site and is confronted with numerous products, basically they see every product page, every overview page. You can use these different principles and get at least some cue of how people will respond to them. And over time, basically what you do, if you get a success for one of these strategies, we improve or increase the estimate of the success. We also increase our certainty because we're starting to get more data about this specific individual person. And over time, we're building a more and more refined profile of each individual user on which of these persuasion principles they actually respond to. Now, all I've told you up till now is basically how do you learn, and what we do in learning is we combine what other people do with what individuals do. We use a lot of hierarchical models. We use this in a streaming fashion to actually be able to serve updated profiles to our clients in near real time, because it's all streamingly processed. What I haven't talked about yet is then, given a profile, so given that I know Tim's profile, which page am I going to show to him? Now it makes some sense to say, okay, if whomever, let's keep Tim again, has the highest estimate for authority, then I should only show products that are endorsed by authorities. On the other hand, if that's what I do, then I'll never learn anything about the other strategies. And that's detrimental in two ways. I mean, in one, you don't get any information about the other ones, which might actually be better than authority. But on the other hand, it might also be the case that whatever drove the high estimate of authority is partly noise, basically meaning that you're highly overestimating the strategy, which means that every now and then you might want to explore some of the other strategies. And it gets to what I think is one of the most interesting problems actually in machine learning. It's called the explore-exploit trade-off. Given that you have some uncertain information about your users, which of the versions of content are you going to show, and how are you going to balance the fact that what you know is what you want to exploit? So given Tim's estimate of authority being the highest, I want to exploit this and show him the authority appeals. But on the other hand, I want to know more about him, and I can only know more about him by showing him other things. And one popular way of actually phrasing this same problem is called the multi-armed bandit problem, where basically you say, look, suppose I give you $1,000, put you behind a row of 6 slot machines that's relating to the 6 principles of Chialdini. Now, you don't know which one is going to work best, but you do know one of them is going to have a higher payoff than the other ones. In which order are you going to put your $1,000 into those machines to make sure that you optimize your profit? Now, if we're really talking about slot machines and you want to optimize your profit, then you're better off not throwing any of those dollars in any of the machines. However, if we're actually trying to pitch these different persuasion principles to people, what we get to is that there's several algorithms that have been developed recently. One of them published in 2010 by Scott, who was at the time, and I think still is, working for Google, which is called randomized probability matching, which basically naturally weighs off how much do I earn, what's my expected profit given playing one of these machines, and how certain am I of this estimate. And using these types of algorithms, and there's more of these, you've got Gittins indexes for simple problems, but using these types of algorithms, you can actually optimize over content in a way that at the average level actually beats A/B testing the effect of these principles. But with every click that you get from a user, you get better because the profile gets more informed, you make a better decision, and you try to optimize your profit over all the information that you have, given that you want to basically select one of the different ways of pitching product to an individual customer. Now, that's what we do, and maybe some of you are kind of interested in what does that lead to. And obviously, if you want to know what that leads to, you just test it. I mean, you A/B test it in the same period of time, you get a few, for example, 20% of your clients to not run with this adaptive algorithm, and the rest of them, you do run with this adaptive algorithm. And what do you get? Well, what you get is what a lot of our customers got, and it is just a little slight list of people that are actually using persuasion profiling nowadays to increase their profits. But what we get is that for some of the customers, depending on how often people come back, and obviously depending on how much they've optimized their sites already, is that we get conversion up by 20–25%. These are numbers that we're actually finding repeatedly. So maybe I should get back to where did the examples go, because I did introduce you in the beginning and told you that I would talk not only about the science and about what the company do, but I would also talk a bit more in detail on how we actually do this, or what does this entail in practice. So in practice, what does it mean to use persuasion profiling? I'm going to talk you through a very simple, one simple example, which is actually a hypothetical example using an American Express email, because we're doing a lot of email optimization at the moment, but just to show what it would mean for a company to start doing persuasion profiling. Basically what it means is you take an offer that you have, a product that you're pitching to people, maybe an email that you're sending out, and from that one email you create multiple versions. What are those multiple versions? Those are multiple versions that each implement these different persuasion principles. And one of the nice things about this is that if you, for example, have a returned email, you can use different implementations of the same principle. So you can appeal to social proof, you can make an authority appeal, you can make a scarcity appeal, using different types of content. And one of the things we obviously actively do is actually help people write this content. We provide quite a repository on our website as well. But what we try to do is make different pieces of content. From one piece of content, we make different implementations that each have these different persuasion principles. So just a few examples of these would be for social proof. It's appealing to what other people have done. So you're saying, for example, that the service is very popular. It's popular, apparently lots of other people are doing this, so you're appealing to this idea of social proof. For authority, it might be using an authority in the field of what you're actually trying to sell. So this was the actual original email is about American Express travel insurance. The Lonely Planet would definitely be an expert or an authority in the area of travel. So the Lonely Planet worldwide travel expert, they recommend this specific travel insurance. Or we use, for example, scarcity, where you say, look, this offer that we have now for this travel insurance is only valid for a limited period. So only this week you actually get a 10% discount. Now we got the same content, the same appeal, we're trying to sell the same products, but we're just using these different persuasion principles. And what we get for example, email, is that if you have recurrent emails and you can recurrently implement these principles and every time see how your email recipients actually respond to it, that we find that in some of the studies we're running, we have over 100% of conversion increase after 5 to 6 emails. This is basically, if you had some time to learn, you're actually getting better. I must say that I don't believe that at any point in time such a profile is ever fully perfect or fully done. The only thing we're trying to do is just become slightly better every time we can see some of these observations and adapt which of these principles we're using. So what we often see for clients is that with the second email that we send out, if we're optimizing an email campaign, we're slightly more effective than the first, and we're trying to improve every time when we send out a new mailing batch. We're seeing similar figures in e-commerce where we actually can, within or in between page views, hand out a new advice how to build up a page given somebody's previous history and select the correct persuasion principle. So that was pretty much what I want to talk about and how I want to introduce persuasion profiling. And I think we got quite some time to actually take some questions here and there or ask me whatever you want to know. I'm more than willing to talk a bit more about the nitty-gritty of the machine learning that we're doing, or just more on the content side, how do we get it running, or share more about the actual business case that we have. I don't know how the audience is composed at this moment and what are the things that are most of interest to you guys, but I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, fantastic. Well, Maurits, thanks so much for that. We are going to move into the Q&A. So, folks, if you haven't done so already, go ahead and ask your questions. We've already had a pretty lively dialogue going on. Just go to the Q&A pane in your control panel and type in your questions, and I'll try to field some of them and have a discussion. Before we do that, while we're waiting for you to enter your questions, I'm just going to have a couple of special offers here for the folks listening on the webinar. And what we'd like to do is just mention to you our Express review service. If you're interested in having us take a look at your page, and we will, of course, include discussions of calls to action and the different psychological principles involved, among other things. Sign up for one of our Express reviews. It's an interactive, recorded via GoToMeeting. You get the video transcript as well as all the questions. And if you mention Rockstars, as in Science Rockstars, you get $100 off if you order within the next couple of weeks or so. Also, if some of you may be familiar with the Conversion Conference, this is a series that we run in the U.S. and in Europe. We just had a great show in San Francisco, and our next one is coming up here very quickly in June. If you use the promo code Rockstars when you register, you get $200 off either the Chicago show coming up or the Boston show at the end of September. So we really hope to see you there. We've had some outstanding speakers over the years, and if you really want to learn, we pride ourselves on the strength of the program and the programming and the opportunity to interact with leading practitioners and speakers in the field. So with that, I think we'll just throw it over to the Q&A portion. We have a lot of people asking questions, so I'm just going to take these in no particular order. So one question that Nancy had, Maurits, is using a single principle versus using two together, or maybe broaden that out a little bit, why not take all of the different kind of persuasion ideas that Dr. Cialdini has and use all 6 of them for this mega super, atomic bomb of persuasion?
Yeah, well, so there's a few things. I mean, one thing is for pitching a single product or doing a single ad, we've tried this multiple times. Basically, what you find is that using one is more effective than using many of these. Obviously, it depends on how you implement them, but it's like averaging over 50 different attempts with single ones or with multiple ones, and we'll find the same consistent story. But I think there's a good story behind why this is actually happening. So if you start thinking about why do these principles even work, like why do people do what other people do, or why do people listen to authority? I mean, one of the prevailing theories about this is that these are actually mental shortcuts that we have learned and often lead us to the right decision. So think about walking into a building where at that moment everybody is running out. You're fairly likely to turn around and join them on running out instead of walking in and establishing for yourself that there is indeed a fire and walking out afterwards. And it was actually a great decision for you to follow the other people, save you time, and it actually saved you probably from the fire in that point.
Okay, so really, you basically the idea is if these are shortcuts, we're only kind of tuned to certain channels. Overloading us with a bunch of alternatives doesn't necessarily help. Is that what you mean?
Well, exactly. And if these are shortcuts, basically if you put a lot of emphasis on them, they're not going to work anymore. Because if you have shortcuts, that means you're not necessarily consciously processing all of this. Well, if you put many of these in front of people, one of the first things that will happen is they'll start processing them more actively. And by processing them more actively, they're going to go and basically see all these people run out and wonder, well, is there really a fire? And they're going to see whether or not it holds. And that might not always be beneficial for what you're doing. I mean, do people indeed buy that the Lonely Planet was the right expert for what they're trying to do? So one of the things I think you're just doing when you're using many of these different persuasion principles is that you're getting people to reflect on it more and more, which might not necessarily actually help you.
Okay, that's fair enough. One question we had, somebody's asking for the actual references or the primary research here. One of the books that Dr. Cialdini's book, he's written several books, but this is the one that we're referring to. I think primarily is Influence: The Psychology of Persuasion, and so that one is the one that we recommend you get that talks about this in detail. Any other kind of reference works or anything else you want to cite?
So I recently published my own book, but it's in Dutch. We're looking to get it into English, so if anybody is interested in the Dutch one, do let me know. But on persuasion-profiling.com, that's where about 1 year ago, Dean Eccles and I, who were doing a lot of work like academically in this area, we're trying to collect some of the papers that we were writing and that other people were writing. So there's a small collection there. And if you want to know more, it kind of depends on what type of stuff you want to read. If you want to read the academic papers, then that's definitely a good way in. Otherwise, just drop me an email or contact me. I'm happy to share some of the more novel stuff or some of the stuff that's in press. On the other hand, if you want a more popular account, and definitely if this is the first time you start thinking about persuasion and how to do it, I would say go for the book, the Influence book by Cialdini. It's super well written.
Yep.
It's just a great way of getting it.
I'll have to second that. Okay, question here from Daniel. He wants to know if can you dynamically change based on the session, which pages that they're seeing. I guess what you're saying is you're constantly, every time you show any new page to a visitor, you're going to kind of sample and either show them something based on one of the principles or another one to see how they react to that. So can you talk about kind of how you're switching up the pages and how you're deciding which ones to show?
Yeah, so technically, basically what we're doing is for most of our clients, the moment they render a page, so you go to a page, what they do when they render a page, make a call to our services, which we call an Get Advice call, and what we send back is an advice on which of the ways to use to pitch their product. And obviously not all of the ways might always be applicable for products, but basically what happens is that even within a session, the moment you load a new page, there's a call to our service. We'll send back, okay, this is somebody whom we believe, given his previous history, should see a social proof argument. You render it and send back whether or not these people actually bought.
Okay, so to kind of dig into the mechanics of this a little more, what I hear you saying is that you already need to have different versions of your pages, whichever ones you're going to be showing, with variations for each of these principles available. And so they're just doing a quick call out to you, and you're saying, hey, show this version based on this principle next.
Yeah, that's the implementation we most often use. I must admit that often, definitely on e-commerce websites, we don't talk about like full redesign of pages. We're talking about buttons that are placed on top of products, little banners that basically say, look, popular product, or that say especially discounted. Especially on overview pages, mostly it's just a limited set of little kind of icon images where we determine which of the icon images gets placed where on the page. Okay.
One of the things that we've also had questions about, I made an offhand comment, Jay didn't really agree with me. A question somebody else asked about, well, how does this fit in with personas? Personas are typically what ad agencies use. Mary is a hip Manhattanite who likes to drink mojitos and hang out in underground clubs. Does that place have? How does that relate to what you're calling a persuasion profile, and what's the use, if any, is there to kind of more traditional, quote-unquote, personas?
Well, I mean, to me, personas are actually a great way to help people that create content, to create the right content, to get everybody in the same focus and think along the same way, especially in a way that's tailored toward a specific segment of your customers. What we're doing here on some ends, we're actually obviously using these persuasion principles also to generate content. So in that sense, there's definitely some overlap between the use of personas for content creation and the idea of using different persuasive principles is one of the driving forces between your content creation.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that kind of if the traditional personas are good for visualizing your audience, and again, that's how it's traditionally used by ad agencies. So that helps you create the right content if you have a kind of a picture of them in mind, right?
Yeah, but I would say one thing that's different, at least people that are making personas or using personas to target a specific segment. One thing that we're doing slightly differently is that we're not saying that basically based on your previous purchases or whatever, you're a certain type of customer. What we're trying to do is all the time is learn and live with the fact that we're uncertain about our estimates, learn which of these pieces of content that we helped or that we created with the help of these persuasion principles, we're actually going to pitch to you. So we don't have a one-to-one coupling with this is the person, this is what he sees. The principles are useful to generate content. What you see is dependent on how you respond and continuously keeps changing.
Okay. One of the questions, we have had several people ask about kind of the effectiveness of this, and you shared a couple of examples. So let's say somebody kind of plugs your API in and starts customizing the content based on the person's behavior. What kind of results are you typically seeing, and what's the process for actually plugging your stuff into a website or a landing page?
Yeah. So I've shared some of the results that we have seen and that we are seeing. It is a tough question though, because it does depend obviously on what you're doing already. As I was saying, a lot of these persuasion principles also just have an average effect that is positive. So some of our clients, they start out with never having thought about using any of this type of content, and they have comparisons where they go from basically zero to actually personalizing this type of content specifically for their individual customer.
Okay, so in a way, what you're saying is, look, these principles, which Dr. Cialdini has researched in a wide range of situations, they're always, or they're generally going to improve things. So it's hard to kind of disentangle that from kind of your adaptive approach of zeroing in on each specific principle, right?
Well, it's not necessarily hard to disentangle, because obviously you can just A/B test the different types of content and then select the one that's best on average and pitch that against the actual personalization. But it's a lot of people ask the question, how much better am I going to be? And that obviously depends on what you're already doing.
And what your audience is, of course, and what.
Yeah, there's a lot of steps between, and basically what we also find is that if you have customers that come back only once, or basically there's no way to identify people over multiple visits, then what we end up doing is a fairly fancy A/B test of these different principles.
Right. So that brings up a great question, which someone else asked, which is how long does it take to kind of establish a profile? How many visits or page views do you need to start zeroing in effectively on what someone cares about?
Yeah. So there's two sides of that question, I would say. One is that we find that like after, and it's especially for email marketing because it's very easy to track people over longer periods, that like after 25, maybe 30 interactions, we're starting to get fairly large groups of people whose estimates are not changing a lot anymore. So we're kind of certain that we're addressing them in the right way. On the other hand, it's not the case that we need to do 30 interactions before we make a decision. Actually, the second interaction that we have with people is going to be slightly more effective than the first, because some of these estimates did change based on that one click or that one purchase. So in some end, yes, of course, at some point you get to more stable profiles, but to me that's not even the aim of what we're doing. The aim of what we're doing is not to perfectly profile you. The aim of what we're doing is just given the history that we have of you,
improve on what you have.
Yeah, just given what we have, it's slightly more effective.
It's okay. We have had a couple of questions of, are these principles different for business to consumer, business to business? Are there any differences in terms of your industry or kind of specific application? Have you seen this be more effective in some circumstances than others? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I mean, for the business-to-business versus business-to-consumer case, I don't think we have very good cases to actually compare this right now. On the other hand, I think often it's humans making these decisions, and what we're talking about is why do people make certain decisions and how do we influence them.
So people are people. That part shouldn't matter.
Yeah, so I would say there's not too big a difference there. On the other hand, what we do find is if you're asking how does this relate for certain product categories, for example, what we find is that for some of our clients, some strategies work really well. Really well meaning that just on average, one of them might be by far the most effective. And I started thinking about this, and initially when we started seeing this, it's like, hey, is it industry specific or product category specific? I think what we're finding now is that mostly it is basically determined by how people were communicating before they started using this. Because obviously, if you always have this website that has the latest deal that's only valid for a day, you're going to attract a crowd of people that's interested in this scarcity argument. So then if you start optimizing which of these principles you're actually pitching, you're going to find that for a large group of your customers, scarcity will be effective. So we find that how people have been communicating in the past determines the types of customers they select. And for some of our clients, that's actually fairly noticeable in the sense that they really have specific principles being more effective than they are for other people in their branch.
So because this is kind of a self-selecting group, they've been, for example, pushing the, today only kind of Groupon model, then they're going to, of course, attract the last-minute scarcity people.
They're going to attract those people. And I must admit that we're finding this mostly with scarcity-oriented kind of appeals, because there's just a few people that are, or there's a number of companies that are really, and have been for a few years, kind of advocating themselves as the last-minute deal, or not like this one and only opportunity, and it's kind of obvious that they attract customers that are susceptible to that argument.
Okay, well, we're getting a lot of questions that are somewhat similar. Brian and Josh are asking. Basically, still, there's no way around this. This is a learning algorithm, and so you can't really do this with one-time visitors. It's not very helpful. You need the more interaction they have with you, either navigating around your site or actually doing one of the calls to action, the better, right?
Yeah. I mean, as I'm saying, look, if you're doing basically what we're doing with one-time visitors only, we're doing a slightly fancier A/B test because we're kind of considering its explore-exploit trade-off also at an aggregate level. But this has been kind of other companies that are offering A/B testing, that are offering multivariate testing, are also moving in that direction. So they were certainly not the only ones. And I would even say, look, if that's what you want to do, just test a few of this piece of content and you have no recurrence whatsoever, then we might not even be the best guy to talk to.
Okay, and then Jesse was asking about, well, there's obviously a focus on Cialdini, but there's a lot of other kind of theories of persuasive communication. So why are you focused on Cialdini? Do you find that those are the most useful ones, or how does this compare to other frameworks of persuasion?
Well, for me, like the principles by Cialdini, one, I mean, there's a lot of research supporting each of them, basically. And I find them useful in the sense that these are things that we find that people that write content can actually think about. On the other hand, why we're using them right now is because we have actually done those studies showing that people differ in how they respond to these types of messages and that they are quite consistent. I do not believe that Cialdini's summary covers everything that's there and that there might not be more or less useful taxonomies of persuasion principles. However, for me, such a taxonomy should be based on how do people respond to it. So what I want to do is group pieces of content together that actually, if the same person sees one of those pieces of content, responds in the same way. And luckily, we are starting to actually be able to collect a data set that does this. For some of our customers, we're basically trying to keep track not just of the principle that we're pitching, but of the exact content that we're pitching, which is starting to lead up to us having the opportunity to see if they can group together in other ways.
Okay.
something that I think even just in the scientific community, there's no consensus on how many of these strategies there are, and basically how
which ones are most effective. Yeah, so and what you're saying is, that really depends on your audience and highly depends on the individual anyway. So one of the questions we have is, so it sounds like the more you follow me around, as it were, the more likely my profile is to stabilize and for you to have a real good idea of what I prefer. So this is something that would work across kind of multiple sites. Have you done any work, are you going to extend this to kind of having a permanent profile of someone, maybe a kind of at an ad network level almost, so that when they get to my site, I can benefit from the knowledge of what they've done on other people's sites?
Yeah, I mean that's a very obvious extension of what we're doing that we have been thinking about ourselves as well. Now, especially in Europe, there's definitely some legal constraints as to how much you can share these things. But those put aside, I think it would be very useful to actually be able to take these kind of profiles from one store to another store. And one of the extensions we're even thinking about is showing the profile to the actual customer. I mean, why, if you're looking for things that are actually popular, or if you're looking for things that are recommended by authorities, I'm not necessarily sure whether this is something that should be hidden from you. It can also be fed back to you. So I'm definitely interested in kind of seeing how can we extend the profile over multiple clients and maybe even make a personal profile personal, basically giving it to the customer. But these are all extensions that we're not doing currently that we would love to do, would need to see how it would actually work out technologically.
Okay. Now, one of the questions we had was, how does mobile play into all of this? And does it matter what device you're on, or have you given any considerations to how this would look on mobile?
A lot of the things we have done are text-based, and actually one of the previous studies that we've done was short text messaging. So these are, for me, mobile devices primarily are just limits on your screen and what you can meaningfully show to people, what you cannot. But I think that a lot of these things work purely text-based as well. So even on relatively small screens, one could use this. Other than that, I don't think people are going to respond extremely differently when they're at a different device. But it's something we're definitely willing to dig into further. And as I said, a lot of these things, which I think are meaningful questions, are popping up now that we're tracking individuals. A lot of these things are not necessarily answered in the scientific community. You need to collect data sets to start answering these questions. Some of them we're collecting as we speak.
Okay. Well, that brings up another interesting question some people had, which is, you said this is kind of text-based, and a lot of the things you're describing is the offer or the formulation, or as you put it, how you ask the question. So really, this gets back to kind of persuasive copywriting. Do you have any resources or authorities in the field of how do you actually construct appropriate messages, or who do you look to for that kind of guidance?
Yeah, so I mean, a few of the things we look to are the people working in our company, because we have attracted a few people coming from communication science, social psych, people that are actually working scientifically on these things, but also people from the field, and just looking at what are people using at this moment, because a lot of these principles are being used on all kinds of websites. My initial idea, actually, when we started the company two and a half years ago, was basically that we would provide the machine learning part of it and have everybody who uses this have fun. However, that didn't really work out. People need to be trained on how to write that content, and obviously by doing this for over 2 years, we're actually getting more and more experience in writing this content, and we're getting more experience in what works, what doesn't work. So currently we're very actively helping our clients create content.
Right, so it's kind of a learning on the job situation, though, for both you or someone interested in this more. But I mean, the traditional stuff like direct response, copywriting, or Eugene Schwartz. I mean, some of these really well-known things for motivating people with the right psychology. Do you find that stuff is helpful or foundational, or do you or is it really highly situational?
No, I mean, we find a lot of these types of resources helpful, and to me it kind of highlights like what do you do with theory. So these kind of examples that are there, the things that other people have brought up on how to write content. A lot of this for us is inspiration. We'll write it and we'll test it and see for ourselves what works, basically. Because in the end, I do want to drive the content we create based on how people are responding to it, not based on some other logic of making.
Well, and it's one thing to say theoretically this uses the scarcity principle versus social proof, but
Yeah.
exactly how you word it is probably even more important. So probably testing alternative versions of your copy. There's still testing within each principle, I would expect, over time.
Yeah, that's true, and that just basically what I was referring to earlier is just not modeling only the principle, but also the exact content that you're using and trying to see there if you can get patterns in content that are apparently proper implementations of the strategy you're trying to appeal to, and using that knowledge to write better content in the future.
Okay, and Lauren was asking about how product reviews and testimonials fit into this. So for e-commerce, is that an example of social proof or more kind of outside authority? How do you see reviews?
Oh, reviews were often you pitching as a social proof argument, whether or not we're actually showing them. So one of the things is like how many people bought this thing, or the stars that people give, the thumbs up that people give. One of the things we do is just are we actually using these in the product presentation or not? So are we using them? Obviously, from a machine learning point of view, if you wonder whether these product reviews are a separate category somewhere in between authority, social proof, basically what we can do is model them separately. And what we're always trying to do is see, besides the fact that we have a streaming algorithm, which is needed to make sure that we can do these adaptations on the fly, is look back to the data that we have, and is there any reason to model things explicitly separately given your context, given your content that we're writing. So we're always, like, I don't necessarily think there's a definite answer to this question. We're usually pitching it as a social proof principle, and that's how we start off modeling it. If there's reason to change, we will.
Okay. One more quick question about using multiple approaches. Have you ever seen, well, Dennis asked if you've ever seen where combining approaches actually does even better than any single approach. I mean, maybe not all of them at once, but maybe reciprocity strengthened by scarcity or something. I don't know.
I mean, as I said, well, one thing we've done is like over tens and tens of Google ads, try these different versions. And some of the joined ones were definitely not performing much worse. So you can find a combination that will work. Obviously, there's quite a lot of permutations that you can try. And I would say the best way of actually using multiple of them, and this works for a lot of people that are selling stuff online, is actually just having a consistent single principle with a single product, but on a product page or an overview page, you can obviously have multiple products and use multiple of these principles. And I think that that's actually the best use, because having one specific product with multiple of these principles, I don't buy is something that actually makes it more effective. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, now Nigel was asking about if you don't know anything about someone, then what should you be doing? I mean, so I guess back to your comment, it's probably true that most persuasion principles that have been shown to work in a wide range of circumstances, you should probably be using them even if you, as opposed to not using them, right? Even if you're not personalizing to the individual.
I mean, definitely give that type of content a try. I mean, if you have a number or a large number of visitors, just A/B testing different types of content is cheap, is something you can easily do, and something you should definitely try. And that also gets back to what do you do with first-time customers. I mean, what we do with first-time customers is just make basically a copy of the aggregate profile that we maintain. So even on average, we maintain which of the strategies are most effective. If there's nothing else we know about a person, then we're just going to relate to how did, on average, other people on this website respond. We're going to make that very uncertain, but we still have some information of what's happening. But you basically end up with a slightly less than random, but searching through the space of different content.
Okay, so let's just say you have, for a specific example, you have a version that uses each of the 6 principles. So you have 6 different versions of your page, and you know on average one of them outperforms the others. Well, that's the one you'd show as kind of your default to a new visitor, right?
Well, I mean, that's more likely to be shown to a new
Right, more likely, right, sorry, because you're still kind of doing kind of a random sampling.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, I'm afraid that, folks, that we are out of time. We have a bunch more questions we didn't get to. Again, to remind you, you will get a copy of both the recording as well as the slides that Maurits was using. We'd love to see you in Chicago in a couple of weeks, or Boston at the end of September. So spread the word. Hopefully we'll see you on an upcoming SiteTuners webinar.